Welcome to tonight's special edition of CCA's Spring Design Lecture Series. I am Josh Silverman, Chair of the Master of Interaction Design program. Thank you all for being here with us. Joining me is Nina Eve Zeninger, our program manager for the MDes program and the DMBA program, and our special guest, Cheryl Platz. In a few minutes, we will introduce Cheryl. Quick plug for Cheryl's latest book, released in December 2020 from Rosenfeld Media. We're going to pop a discount code in the chat for you all, good for 20% off all books, not just Cheryl's book, but all books available on rosenfeldmedia.com, and that discount is good through April 5th. Shout out to Lou Rosenfeld. Thank you, Lou, for the discount. Thank you for submitting questions in advance, but since none of us have seen tonight's presentation, we're going to balance that Q&A that follows the presentation with questions that arise tonight. Please use the Q&A feature shown here on the left. You can upvote questions you would like Cheryl to answer. Additionally, closed captioning is available during the webinar. Next to the Q&A, you'll see a button that says live transcript. Inside that, you will see options to show subtitles, open a full transcript, or edit your subtitles. If this feature poses any challenges for you, please use the chat and Nina or I can help you. On a final housekeeping note, Nina has shared our community agreement in the chat. Please take a moment to read it. The design division at CCA is a sanctuary for those with radical curiosity, where wonder and imagination are amplified through rigor and craft. We equip makers, thinkers, and doers with the wherewithal to envision alternative futures and the creative capacity to deliver generative solutions that inspire change. We have 6 undergraduate and 3 graduate programs listed here. The California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples who have continuously lived upon that land since time immemorial. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders with this land acknowledgement. We have had an awesome and diverse lecture series this spring, and the final 2 presentations are starting next Thursday. Jomo Tariku will present African Furniture Design, a Personal Perspective. And then lastly, on March 18th, my friend Margot Bloomstein will present Fostering Trust in Your Brand and Beyond. Shout out to MDes faculty Jorge Arango for featuring both tonight's guest and Margot on his podcast called The Informed Life. And now, without further ado, I will introduce tonight's guest. Cheryl, if you could please turn on your video. Excellent, okay. Welcome, Cheryl. You are a designer, speaker, author, board member at Unexpected Productions, an actress, and improv assassin. Your professional passions include natural user interfaces, applied storytelling in design and research, and taming complexity in any manifestation, or WU manifestation if you're nasty. Previous employers and projects include Amazon Alexa, Microsoft Azure and Cortana, and the Electronic Arts. Last December, Cheryl's book was published. Way to get it started with your first book, Cheryl. Her current full-time role as principal UX designer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Inside the foundation, she conducts ethnographic research driven by continued employee insight. In her free time, Cheryl is also principal and owner of her own design education firm, Idea Platz. Her unique background also includes over 15 years as a professional actress and improviser. Welcome, Cheryl. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Josh, and thank you, Jorge, for the introduction. And hello, everybody. Zoom decided that we're going to go fish-eyed today, so okay, that's fine. Well, we'll try one more time. That's fine too. It's very ornery today. So I'm very glad to be joining you. Thank you for the warm introduction. And I'm going to share my screen now so we can get started. Uh, so today's talk, you probably signed up for it after reading the description, but is capturing customer context for cross-channel experiences. And we're going to be doing about 30 minutes of talk, and then we'll have about 20 minutes left in the session for Q&A. And I'm glad to hear that there are so many questions already submitted, so we'll have a lively conversation. Now, there are a lot of different topics in my book, and this is just a topic from mostly chapter 2 and 7. So tons of other concepts here, but I wanted to choose one of the ones that's most immediately applicable to your work. There's some other things that, maybe not all of us are working in directly applied multimodal design right now. I think many of us are doing cross-device and cross-channel work. I mean, is your website being viewed on both a desktop and a mobile device? Probably. But this particular topic, capturing customer context, widening the scope of our inquiry, is immediately applicable no matter what you're doing. So let's get into it. Before I get started, along the lines that Josh just mentioned, a couple of reminders. Black Lives Matter, and it's been a very difficult year for our Black colleagues. And this talk is being delivered within the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples in Redmond, Washington, specifically the Duwamish tribe. Despite hundreds of years of broken treaties and setbacks, the Duwamish people continue to shine a light here in their ancestral lands as the host tribe of Seattle, all while continuing to petition for formal government recognition. I am grateful to the Duwamish tribe, past and present, and honor their land itself. So, we are heading into a space where no interface has gone before, and I am a big Star Trek nerd and watch it all the time, so go on that topic forever. But if you look on the cover of my book, Captain Picard is hidden there, so I dare you to find him. But we're designing products at the final frontier. Your customer has 5 senses and a small universe of devices. Why are we not designing for all of them? I mean, so many of us are stuck just thinking about the desktop and maybe mobile and not considering all of the other ways our customers are interacting with the world around them. Speaking of which, making sure my echo is muted because I might mention it a couple of times. So it's a big shift, and it's a scary shift for some of our stakeholders. And the website has been declared dead several times already, and yet the web still thrives. It's a huge part of what we do. Our browser choice is still such a big part of our identity, and it lives on many devices and via many forms of interaction. But let's say the prognosticators were right and the website is on its way out. Like, what would replace it? Should you be joining the mobile first revolution that everyone was talking about? Forbes in 2016 was breathlessly reporting about how we could win the mobile first revolution. Or is voice first the way of the future? Just a year later, Nielsen Norman Group was talking about voice first being the future of interaction. That's fast enough to make your head spin. So where are we supposed to go? Which camp are you supposed to throw your weight behind as a designer who's being asked to kind of shift your focus and to perhaps unlearn some habits and learn some new ones? The thing is, our natural instinct to seek a winner is missing the point. There is no one true interface. And most of the devices your customers are using are multimodal themselves already. The future is multimodal because humans are multimodal. A mode in this context that we're discussing right now is a type of communication, and humans communicate using their senses. And I say a mode in this context because, ironically, the word mode is multimodal. But here we're going to call a mode a type of communication. A multimodal interaction is an exchange between a device and a human being where multiple input or output modalities may be used simultaneously or sequentially depending upon context and preference. Now, in many cases, the multimodal experiences today, when you switch between modalities, it's often because the device forces you to. Like if you had an Xbox Kinect back a day when you were talking to it, eventually if you tried to do a login sequence and be like, yeah, get the controller, that's a multimodal transition. But in an ideal world, we'd be able to choose when we move between interaction modalities. That's a more inclusive world. It brings everybody along no matter what their various disabilities might be or their situational disabilities in the moment. But it's a big lift, and it adds a lot of complexity. Multimodal experiences incorporate classic interactions like screens and keyboards and mice and touch with newer tech like voice, gesture, lights, and sensors. Now, you don't need to incorporate all of these things. That's probably a lot for a single scenario. But those are the tools you have at your disposal, and you as a designer or researcher are going to be ascertaining which of those are appropriate to make available to your customer in the moment. So communication modalities, let's talk about those a little bit. They don't match up exactly one-to-one with our senses. I'm not going to talk today about communicating with taste. I'm not going to unpack that Pandora's box. But let's talk about the other communication modalities. Visual communication, obviously, projection or rendering of a stimulus that will be interpreted over optical channels. Usually static. That's the visual channel static. So, as compared to the kinetic channel, where the communication is based on movement or orientation in space. So, the difference here is like reading a book, it's just the pixels, right? Like the page flip is not giving you any information. It's the pixels in words or the actual, if you're reading a paper book, the ink. Uh, and that's where you're getting the information. Um, Versus like a dance, taking the photo is not giving you information. It is the movement through space that is giving you the information. It's the difference between a click on a mouse and the movement of a pen. The click is a point in space. It's like that's a point in time versus kinetic. That's movement. So the kinetic kind of differentiates both visual and another category here, haptic, which is communicating meaning with changes to the physical environment, pressure, vibration, force feedback, or direct manipulation like taps or clicks. So those two, we're very familiar with visual and haptic communication. We've done it all the time. And you're right that mice kind of straddle the gap between haptic and kinetic. So if you were working in a drawing program and you're inking with the mouse is actually engaging in kinetic input. But if you're clicking, that's haptic input. And visual, again, like if you're just looking at the screen and it's an image, that's visual, but a GIF is actually giving you a communication based on movement. Like it's telling you a story, and that stimulates a little bit more than just your optical cones in your brain. There's a little bit more that you're putting together, a little bit more reasoning there. And then, of course, we have auditory communication, the use of acoustic waves to communicate meaning, music, sound effects, or language. We mostly think about communication with words these days because of our smart speakers. But don't forget the importance of music or sound effects. I've spent 5 years in video gaming, and they're a very big part of how humans communicate. And the last category is ambient. Ambient communication. This is an interesting one. Not a lot of people talk about this, but to me, ambient communication is inferred meaning driven by environmental or biometric conditions, temperature, heart rate, lighting, etc. So to me, it's kind of like putting your intent in a bank. So you express the desire to say like, hey, when I come home, you should turn the heat up because I'm going to be cold. And then when you come into the house, there's an ambient interaction with you because you're there and the temperature goes up. You didn't interact in that moment. It was your presence that interacted with the system and told it to change state. Now, there is the prior state where you have to tell it what to do a lot of the time. But you could also imagine like an ambient communication that we have already in a way is you could argue that maybe this is kinetic, but the doors we have in grocery stores, the ones where you just like stand there and they open, like your presence there has an impact. So you could argue that that's kinetic or ambient or maybe a combination of both. So you came to this talk and I was talking about customer context. Stay with me, we're going to get there. But part of the reason I'm walking you through multimodality now is because our experiences are so much richer and they're only going to get richer. And to build these richer experiences intelligently, we need richer context. So I'm walking you through the basics of these multimodal experiences so we know why we're asking these interesting questions that I'm about to teach you in the latter half of the talk. So we've explored the dimensions of multimodality, and you may see already that some of your interfaces may already be multimodal in some ways. Touch is gesture a lot of the time if you're doing swipes, so you may already be multimodal in some ways. But there's a lot of different models of multimodal interaction. Sometimes you are interacting with a device that does not have a screen, and you don't always like it has visuals like LEDs, but you can't guarantee that you're going to see them, like a smart speaker. And sometimes you're interacting with a television, which is locked in place. It's got a huge screen, and you speak to a remote control. And the interaction with voice is a lot more subdued and is, subservient to the screen. How do you know which of those experiences is appropriate for your customer's needs in the moment, or where you should position yourself? There's two dimensions of your customer's context that are super important when making this decision. One of them is how rich is your information? Is it on, and it's a little bit of, there's a spectrum. So there's low information density, in which case a smartwatch or a wearable might be just all you need. And then there's high information density, HD films, books, computers, spreadsheets, in which case you're definitely not going to want to work with something small and constrained. And even audio starts to be problematic for those rich things because our ability to process acoustic signals is a bit more limited than our body's ability to process visual signals. It's just a way we adapted. There was way more, as we evolved, before we got language, we still had to process visuals to survive. So we're just a little better at that. And then the other dimension is how close is the customer to the device? So this is a bit of a spectrum, but it's a little bit more binary. I suppose it can't be a little bit more binary. It's not, but there's less gradation on the spectrum. There's close proximity. So maybe the device is always near the customer, or the customer's always near the device. Like they've got a watch near them, or they've the washing machine when they're interacting with it, that they have to be there because the clothes, you're always putting the clothes in the washing machine. Or is there a long range sort of interaction there when they're interacting with it? They're across the room, or they want to be across the room. This is kind of both. It's like, where is the customer when they want to interact with you? It doesn't have to be just where is the device when the customer interacts with it, because the state they're in today doesn't necessarily match where you can get or where your customers want to get. So there's probably a lot of experiences today locked into location where your customers would like to be wandering around tackling that problem in a different way. But once you have answers to those two questions, you can start placing your experience on the spectrum of multimodality, which I talk about in chapter 7 of the book. Now, we'll talk about these in detail in a second, but these four quadrants are four different lenses through which you can view multimodality. And this runs the spectrum from like super hands-off and tangible experiences like smart speakers, to smartwatches in the direct quadrant, to anchored experiences like the desktop I'm working with right now to present to you. And then there's the holy grail of adaptive experiences where they can, they're probably tethered to something, but they support both proximity and long range interactions. Maybe it's a smartwatch that you can leave on a table and go interact with it, or maybe it's the Echo Show where you can have short range and long range interactions. There's this quadrant. There's a lot of richness in this quadrant because it has the most potential for inclusion, but it's also very expensive and difficult. And the experiences I list there as examples are not fully adaptive. Like the Echo Show does let you switch between voice and touch, but like it's not fully touch. You can't navigate to the commands with touch. So somebody who doesn't have control of their voice, this is not going to be a good device for them. You can continue with touch once you've made a voice command. Touch is extending the experience, but there's not like a big old nav tree where you can go and pick what you want to do with the device. Desktop computers have a little bit more potential to be adaptive eventually, but they're not quite there now. Open the chat there. So let's move on. So we've got all these questions, but to answer those questions and to really make sense of this spectrum, you must understand your customer's context to know what interaction model makes sense in the moment. And you may find that you need to operate in multiple quadrants, that you or your customer has enough devices that it makes sense to place focus in multiple quadrants. So context matters. Like what devices does your customer have available? Where do they go? Why do they switch between locations? Where do they want to complete tasks? A lot of questions around where. And this is where it gets interesting because a lot of our usability studies in the past and our interviews in the past, we're able to make assumptions about the where. We're like, oh, well, they're at home and homes look like this. And, and then they go to work and works offices look like this. The pandemic kind of changed everything. And that was before, and that was even, we were already experiencing a lack of context prior to that, where when you've got a smart speaker in the home, it's not just home. Like there's such a wide variety of homes. You've seen it. You've looked into people's houses when you're doing like classes on Zoom and you see it there. So one home is not created the same as another home. We need to get to the context, like how big are the rooms? How many of them are there? People living in studios or they living in mansions? This all has an impact when you're doing things like gestures or you're speaking to the devices. Like, are there multiple people in the houses? So it's not enough to kind of just picture a nuclear family sitting on the couch in front of the TV anymore. There's a lot more there, and that will help you figure out which of these quadrants you want to place in. Now you noticed I haven't mentioned smartphones at all. And they're not on the graph, not on the spectrum. And that's because they're difficult to classify. It kind of depends on the type of content you're presenting. So like for productivity scenarios like Excel sheets or Word documents, to me, smartphones kind of belong in the direct quadrant. They're short range with a constrained screen and when compared to full laptop screens. And so like it's like looking through a little paper tube at a spreadsheet when you're trying to look at a Google sheet on a phone. And that's why you don't see a lot of people using productivity apps on phones. But optimized experiences like gaming land more in the anchored quadrant. That's a device that's like it's it has to be close to you for you to interact with it, but it's a rich experience for you because you're getting a lot of information, so it pushes it from the direct quadrant, which is really light information density, into the anchored experience, which is higher information density. And then voice enabled apps like Alexa on the phone are pushing into the adaptive quadrant where, Alexa's app now wasn't that way when I was there, but you can speak to it, you can navigate with touch. There's a lot you can do there depending on your mood and how you would like to interact with the app. So let's get to cross-channel part of the title of this talk. Cross-channel, which, you can also think of this as cross-device, like in my book title, but more and more people are needing to switch between devices, moving an experience from the car to the phone, moving it, you started a travel search on your phone and now you need to move to the desktop to complete it because it was just too hard to do the flight search on the phone. Maybe that's a dated example because who's doing travel planning right now? Um, but transitions between devices are really important and they're becoming even more so with the proliferation of devices around us. As some experiences kind of lead the way, customers more and more expect to be able to choose the terms of their engagement with your experience. And the reasons they would choose to change the terms of engagement include things like environmental changes. They're commuting, they're traveling, it's dinner time, and like they were listening to a podcast on their phone and now they want to listen to it in the dinner room, the dining room. Exercise, daytime, nighttime shift, even just glare can affect where people and how people want to work. Device suitability, like your thumb doesn't reach properly, so you want to move to a proper keyboard or mouse to do heavy data entry. Physical comfort, temporary interference, kids, multitasking. So there's lots of reasons why enabling transitions are important, but understanding why people would transition is key. Like just it's too much to just say like people can arbitrarily change between devices at any time. Like that's a lot. Instead, it's kind of like, where are the points in this flow where people would be like, I am no longer comfortable doing this interaction here. I want to go to there. And that's where the capturing customer context really becomes important. So let's get into the techniques. Capturing customer context. So there was mention of improv, as was mentioned, Josh mentioned. I am also a professional improviser, a teacher, and a performer. And at my theater, Unexpected Productions, the reason the gum wall exists, fun fact. Don't know how that's going to fare in the pandemic, but that's the subject for another time. We have a shorthand we teach our students and we use ourselves for creating a compelling scene in the moment, because we've got paying customers and they're expecting to see something interesting and cool and probably funny. So how do you get to something that meets those criteria consistently? So we use this CROW, which stands for character, relationship, objective, and where. And we try to define something from each of these dimensions as quickly as possible. We find that if we do this, the audience is able to fill in the rest of the details pretty quickly. They find it a convincing story. They find it like a well-rounded, holistic thing. They're like, okay, that's something I can hang an understanding on. And when we think about it, your stakeholders are probably kind of like my audience, aren't they? They're looking for a convincing picture to change their mind, to help them see that maybe they don't know their customers as well as they used to. They probably need a convincing story to push them down that path. And as far as we're concerned, as the people gathering, CROW is a useful mnemonic to remind us which dimensions we need to go after, to push us in directions we might forget to go otherwise in this world where we need such rich information to build these multimodal cross-device experiences thoughtfully. So let's get into it a little bit. We'll dive into each of the dimensions. So C is for character, also cookie, but here it's character. What defines your customer? In a book I use to teach my classes, called the Improv Handbook, but I recommend it if you're teaching improv. It's a really good sort of framework. They break down the concept of character into 3 dimensions: attitudes, attributes, and choices. And I really like the way they've done this. And I use this in my classes as well. And so I bring this up in the book as a way you can kind of sort of structure your questions when you're digging into what makes a person themselves. So there's attributes, which are like the fundamental quirks and mannerisms about your customer. Skills, quirks, gender identity, preferred pronouns, disabilities, communities, things that are unlikely to change. They may change, right? Like preferred pronouns, like gender identity, those can change over time. But do they change a lot? No, that's usually a big deal. Like it happens maybe a couple times in a lifetime. These are things that are really core to our being. And so example questions, just to make sure we're getting at that. Like how might your customer define their identity to someone? I think it's really important that we've done a lot of blind recruiting for a long time. And if there's anything we learned from last year and the George Floyd protests and all of everything that's happened last year, uh, it's that we need a richer understanding of what makes each of our customers unique and like who they are. Like we can't just cast a blind eye and think everybody's themselves. Like this has to be done sensitively, but it's important. So like let them care. Like instead of asking them a bunch of like checkbox questions, like what are are you male or female? It's like how would you define your identity to me? Like how would you like how would you express who you are to me? Starting with open-ended questions. Like maybe ask about like, do you feel like you identify with any underrepresented groups? Like, do you feel like you're blocked from expressing yourself or from opportunities for anything about your identity? Because this can have a big impact on someone's experience of your product. It may limit their access. It may it may change their perception of your product. There's all kinds of ways. It may mean they are more vulnerable to AI bias with your product. So these are really important questions. Attitudes are our emotions and reactions to outside stimuli, other people, objects, or situations. Attitudes change a little bit more frequently, but also still important. And a big example question here is like you might not ask it as, do you have preconceived notions? Because that sounds a little judgmental, but like, does a customer have some like strongly held opinions or learned behaviors that they would be bringing to this product? Like you're coming into an existing space and they already know how to do this thing, or like a cultural belief or a cultural learning that would influence how they interact with you. And then choices, the actions you take based on your beliefs and attitudes. And you can ask both about past choices and how people might make choices. Uh, it's hard to ask about how people might make choices because you're asking them to be future tellers. But like, if you're asking existing customers, like, why did you choose to seek out the experience? Did you have a choice? Was this chosen for you? So often we overlook whether someone actually consensually became a customer. Did their friend buy it? Did their mom buy it? Did a loved one buy it? And digging into that. And there's lots of other choices too, like why did you choose this particular plan? But those choices are a big deal, and the why is super important. And you may be asking some of these questions, but see that it's a good reminder. The R in relationships is the R is for relationships. So what connects your customer? The closer you are to someone or something, the more likely you are to get emotional about it. Relationships can drive satisfaction and frustration, which is the problem with smart speakers because our brains really want to connect with things that talk to us. So when they like don't recognize us because our accent doesn't match, that's an emotional hit. Like that really like hurts. So but that's kind of another topic for another time. But I could break this down into three types of relationships that you should dig into in your customer outreach. One of them is the human to device relationship, which I have to ask about a lot at the Gates Foundation where I work right now because we do a lot of IT stuff, like device ownership, like are you using personal device or using a foundation device? When did you come in contact with it? What made you choose it if it's personal? Why did you choose this model if it's a foundation device? Anthropomorphization, again, like how close are they to it? Did they name it? Like is it covered in stickers? Like how are they holding it? Like is it precious to them, emotional attachment, or is it something that they're just like flinging around like, I don't care? That's, the that may influence how your app functions. Like if if the customer is using your app on a phone that's just shattered, that's going to have an impact on some of their experience and your choices. Financial investment, like how much they were able to put into the device, feature choices, and self expression, like is the device being used as an extension of their self? Because that too, especially if you're doing hardware or your app is interacting with something that they view as an extension of their self, like if your app interferes with the operation of something that they view as an extension of their self, that is a dangerous territory. And the very emotions about you are going to be amplified one way or the other. Human to business relationships, we're probably pretty comfortable with these, but just as a reminder, like how are they communicating with you? What's the perception of the company? Again, why did they choose you? What are their expectations of you? Like, what's their perception? Do they trust you? They don't have to. And then human to human relationships, which are often overlooked. Like, are they sharing this device with someone else? Is it cooperative? Is it sequential? Like with like one PC for a whole household, so you've got multiple people on it, or like on a shared TV device. Do you trust the people you share the device with? How like do you have to express your identity, or is it being suppressed? Like if two people are using the same Netflix queue, or are you competing for resources or competing to use the device? Those are really important questions. And then, oh, for objective, what drives your customer? What have you defined as your customer's objective? Ideally, this is just a reminder for us if we've been in research a bit, but is what you've defined as their objective truly their end goal or simply a sentence written to get your customer to their feature? Ideally, everybody in this room is not having a problem with this, but I have seen so many times like user stories where it's like, customer browses the list. I'm like, well, that's not a goal. Humans don't browse lists for fun. I mean, there are a few people that browse Netflix lists for fun, but let me tell you, on like Azure, that's not a recreational act. Someone's browsing a list because they have a goal. It's like find the broken server, and so that's what the objective should be. So, and then are you assuming that your solution stands alone, or is the goal actually something much larger that you need to consider? it's not just like open my app, but it's like I need to find an ambulance or something. Uh, are you part of a larger device agnostic human objective that might span multiple experiences? With objective, the most important lesson is don't obstruct it once you've identified it. Timing and context matter. Like, even if you're offering something of value later, you might be obstructing value in the moment. Like, if I came to this site, this uncommon good site that Nielsen Norman cites, I'm pretty sure I didn't come to this home goods site to keep a secret. I came because I wanted to see home goods. And like, this has nothing to do with that goal. And I am just going to go somewhere else. Especially when the close button is so tiny and the no thanks is like nearly invisible. That's just like, you do not respect your customers and I am going away. This seems shady. Wait until the object is done and then provide the offer. Then I'm going to be in the glow of success and maybe I'm willing to subscribe to your newsletter and talk about success. And then the where, the W, is what surrounds your customer. We talked about the what of the surroundings, but this is so important when we talk about device transitions. Where will your customer be when they want to interact with you? Are they sitting, standing, moving? What's in arm's reach? What devices are going to be available? Who else is going to be in those environments? Like, if they're speaking to a device and they're embarrassed because someone else is there, like any open office plan, that's a thing. Are there distractions in the environment? Will customers expect to continue this experience between the locations or devices? There's so much here. Even if you're like, they're at home, like there's so much there. There's so many, I mean, in a studio apartment, even like, have they divided it into zones? Like does it change over the course of the day? Like, there's so much richness in the where. So I'm going to mention a couple of downloads for you. So I have free materials on my site, on the Idea Platz site. So there's a set of paper worksheets if you're a paper person. And when we get back into the office, you can use these for traditional in-room workshop, workshops with your coworkers, or you can just use these for yourself to work through these. These four can be downloaded at the bit.ly DBD context worksheets, or I'm going to give you a way to get these without the links, so don't worry too much about writing this down. There's also bit.ly DBD Idea Platz with a little dash in there, casing matters, but there's a link to those downloads and also other materials, including all the podcasts I've done about the book, a mural template for online versions of a capturing customer context workshop. And this workshop is essentially getting your stakeholders in a room to convince them that they do not know everything about their customer and you should go and do the research to get all this context. So establishing what are the open questions, what you know, what you don't know, etc. I talk about it a bit in the book. And then there's also an interview guide with Crow-inspired questions that I've worked through in my hands-on workshop that I did at Interaction 21 that's based on this content. So we worked through a little bit of both of these. I taught people how to do this workshop with Mural, and we worked through the interview guide and did mock workshops. So those are mock interviews. So those are all available on my website if you go to bit.ly/dbdideaplatz. And then a couple of words on defining your platform. We'll probably go to 4:45. So how do you decide what channels and multimodal interaction models are most appropriate for your experience? Like, you've got all this context, what do you do next? It's the customer context and objectives. Like, the devices your customers own will directly impact their choices. They may not own devices capable of active engagements. So that quadrant goes away for now. Customer objectives will also dictate choices. Like, if they need a lot of rich information, they're not going to go to their watch. That's not going to be a thing. Direct and intangible intangible interactions, like if I need several chapters and I'm not comfortable with audiobooks, probably going to go to the desktop. But you might not know that until you talk to your customer, like whether they're audiobook people. And which interaction models are right for you if you have choices and your customers have like all of the devices. Anchored experiences, your customer will always be close to the device, allowing you to rely on physical input devices, which is great if you want to convey a lot of information. And in those cases, multimodality like voice is usually useful as a shortcut for things like search and navigation, which can be a little bit annoying sometimes with like a remote control. Direct experiences, your customer is always in close range, but this is really limiting. Like, this is super mobile. super limiting, best for a few key, often repeated tasks. And you usually get sensors as a bonus, so you can do some, you know, a sort of inferred ambient stuff, not really well suited to search or text. Intangible experiences where your customer is not near the device, might not even be looking at the device, definitely not in arm's reach, well suited to questions, excellent for search, difficult in multi-user environments. You know, you got kids interrupting you. Have you ever tried that? Or like a spouse when you're trying to interact with a voice device, or any kind of ambient noise. Cars are actually really hard for voice, even though you really need voice in cars. And then adaptive experiences are more inclusive, but more expansive and best when customer context is likely to change. And that can either be like they become situationally disabled or they're moving between experiences, something like that. What else do you need to work out your cross-channel strategy? Like a device and transition strategy, like what devices you support and how people can move between them. A proactivity strategy, like when do you need to bring information to your customer without a request and how you will interrupt them. And a user data strategy, like what profile information is needed across all your devices, what tasks can be suspended, like can you suspend booking a flight and then come back on another device, and what information is needed about those tasks when you come back. And when you're documenting multimodal designs, you want like the starts, you're still going to have to do like voice design and screen design. Like that doesn't go away. You need also the interactions between those things. So things like people starting a scenario, transitioning between different types of interaction, decision points, and key moments like where like you've got branching choices, like you can choose between interaction modalities. This is an example of what a really short multimodal swim lane diagram might look like. I've got a whole chapter where we talk about different techniques there, where you can interact with a phone or your smartwatch in either touch or voice to interact with, or I guess this one is just smartwatch, but smartwatch in touch or voice to book an airport transfer, you know, when cabs would come to pick you up. But the same system that powers a website today can be extended to power a whole constellation of multimodal experiences. So meet your customers where they are by understanding their context and then supporting the modalities and devices they need. So for free downloads, podcasts, and more, that URL I gave you earlier, DBDID Platz, or just navigate up to the About Us on the page and find the book option underneath it. And then if you want to learn more, my book, as mentioned before, covers this and a lot more. And it's available on Amazon or Rosenfeld, but the Rosenfeld, you get a discount. And the code was also in chat, 20% off until April 30th. Good on all Rosenfeld books. And when you order from Rosenfeld, you get a print copy, you get a free ebook copy, which is a pretty good deal. So the final frontier is waiting for you. Good luck. So let's go to questions.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was brilliant. If you wouldn't mind turning off your screen, we can have a discussion for the last few minutes. I do want to point out that Cheryl's discount that she just posted is good through the end of April, and the one that Lou Rosenfeld gave us is good through April 5th. So I would go back and use Cheryl's code. I just have a question before we get to the questions that were submitted in advance. And please, attendees, you're welcome to put questions in the chat or the Q&A feature. I wonder if you could share with us what you feel the most holistically integrated designed experience is that you've seen or felt in the last couple of years. Like, what's something that really like embodies all of the multimodal holistic thinking and doing?
I mean, there's nothing that like is truly super multimodal for me and integrated yet. I want the Echo Show to be that, but like I see and I also worked on it, so like I see the edges on it. I'm like, why can't I pick some of these things off when I don't want to talk to it? I think, you know, from a cross-device perspective, I'm a big Disney fan, and like there's a lot of transitioning between desktop and phone, but also like interacting with point of sale objects, interacting with the rides, and being able to like interact with the same account. the hotels and everything. Like there's a whole story for like a single account and a customer transitioning from home to like airport transfers to the hotel room, and using like a magic band or using your phone as a Bluetooth interaction device. And so when we think talk about cross-device experiences, like the Disney in-park experience in Orlando is really right up there. When it comes to like voice and things like that, there's nothing that like jumps out at me. There was a good example, and I believe in the podcast I did with Jeff Veen, the Presentable podcast, where he had an experience with like working with a washing machine that gave him notifications. And that was, I didn't have that experience, but it sounded like he had a pretty good one. It took a little tweaking, but like that's the kind of thing we want to get to, where you can like interact with that, go watch TV, you get the notification about the wash, you go back and deal with it. It's pretty seamless.
I look forward to that future. What are some questions you keep in mind to ensure a consistent experience across different modes of interaction? I mean, besides the CRO framework that you shared later.
I think a big one is the what devices do you typically use and what's your relationship to them? Like when do you put them down? When do you pick them up again? We make this assumption that phones are near people all the time, but like they're in purses, they're on the charger. That becomes a big problem. So I think like getting past those assumptions and getting down to the real details helps us understand when we need to transition. Understanding like people's preferences on data entry can be really helpful. Like, where do you like to type? How do you like to type? Some people like to type in a keyboard. Some people like the mobile phone. Some people prefer voice to text. A lot of people do that. And understanding your customer group and how that breaks down is going to be really informative on how often they're going to be moving themselves between devices or on what screens you're likely to see a transition forced, and can help you make better decisions. So things like that, personal preferences, and getting a good sense of what people's disabilities are is another good one, because like a lot of the decisions you make about multimodal design can be influenced by like inclusivity. Like if you design for inclusivity, everybody's going to benefit, and you can design for inclusivity by getting a better perspective on people's even short-term disabilities, or like what was an injury you had recently where you had difficulty using a machine, or a permanent disability. Asking for those things and taking those in consideration up front also helps make smarter platform decisions up front, like seeking out aggressively the hardest constraints you can find.
It's so much easier to think about those things up front rather than downstream when they become more expensive. So we have some questions that are being fed to us live. One just came in from Graham. How might our devices become more aware of a preferred modality of interaction so that so they understand not sending us a notification on every device we own all the time, for example?
Great question. I've got like a whole couple of chapters on that in the book. So there's preferred modality, and then there's awareness and presence. Our devices need to be more polite. And understanding our customer context leads us to another topic I didn't have time to talk about today, which is, to me, an activity model of human behavior. Once you know what your customers are doing, you can establish patterns of behavior and build that pattern into something you can represent in code, which we had to do for Alexa notifications when I designed it. So like there's a difference between someone taking an like a sustained activity like rocking out to music where I can pause it and lose no context, and being on a live call where if I'm interrupted, I lose the context of the call or the live TV show. And the device should understand the difference between those two things and interrupt me differently in those situations. But you need to be able to flag different interactions as this is live, this is sustained, to have a consistent approach to those interruptions. When it comes to like things like preferred device and preferred situation, location awareness, activity awareness, like there's a lot that we aren't picking up, possibly because of privacy concerns, but like my watch and my phone know when I'm active. And they've started to do this a little bit on the iOS suite, where I'll only get a notification on one depending on which one has been recently active. Like with my two-factor authentication at the Gates Foundation, it'll pop to whichever device has been most recently used. And I didn't tell it to do that. it's just doing that. Like any app can make that judgment if it's installed in both of these places. So even if, your app is only installing notifications, having that awareness between the two devices, understanding that that data needs to be shared can unlock a much more sensitive approach to notifications. And then also having a sort of system for your notifications and understanding the difference between a marketing notification and like an awareness notification and an action oriented notification where someone needs to act is really important too. And not everybody does that with their notifications. Could go on for days. Good question.
All notifications are not created equal.
No.
Another question, just in how much of a problem do you think topics of burnout or tech addiction tied to your device will become in the future?
Well, I think the anthropomorphization thing is really interesting. Like with the more devices speak, the more we're going to get like an emotional connection to devices, and that's going to be a little hard to unpack. And with great power comes great responsibility. If your device speaks, especially if you're not in the state of California where it's illegal to not to identify as a bot, then you can really mess with the person if you're not careful. You can make people feel guilty. You can make them come back too often. So I think that's a real risk. People could abuse that trust, and because speech is directly wired into our emotions in a way we can't control. With other types of burnout, like if people don't put the attention into making these systems um, more etiquette based, then I think we're going to get to a point where people just turn off all notifications. And then we're going to be in a place where all of our apps are just ignored. Do we want that? I don't think we do. So we should tread carefully now so that we're not just completely summarily dismissed later. Or regulated. You wouldn't want that either. And people would be within our rights if we harm people with addiction. But we're on the path, so we need to tamp it down and
Yeah,
never assume that people are going to set the settings themselves. It's such a crutch. Like I see it all the time in enterprise. Like, well, people could turn it off if they want to. Nobody wants to go to your settings. Nobody knows that they're there. Like they don't have the time if they're busy and the notifications are stressing them out. They didn't have time to go into the settings and alter the things. That's why they're stressed in the first place.
right.
So it's smart defaults, responsible defaults need to be the default.
We have just a few minutes left, so I'm wondering if you could give us a forecast of the future of interaction design or the future of multimodal design from your perspective. And I think that will be our last discussion point.
Okay, sure. So I do feel like I'm a couple months ahead of where people are ready to be right now. Like I think it's going to take a while before people are like, oh, I really need to dive into this. But what's really interesting to me is, especially with the pandemic, things shifted a little bit. And I think when we make the shift to go back into offices, we're going to hit a reckoning. No one's going to want to touch a whiteboard marker. Like, and then we're going to have people like back in like sequestered like plastic cubes again, where maybe voice would make more sense. Like if you're in a shared keyboard situation, you're going to want to touch that, or you're just going to want to talk to the workstation. Gestures. Like I think, and in public spaces, like things that might have been like touch panels. Again, like is gesture the way? Is voice the way? Like as my sort of not quite employer Bill Gates has mentioned, like this isn't necessarily the last pandemic. And this has just demonstrated how vulnerable we are. And so whether we adapt now or later, we need to shift the way we deal with physical interaction in high traffic places. And so I think, to me, that's going to be the tipping point where uh, a bunch of designers start to have to engage on this in earnest. Is like people who are trying to do startups or level up existing productivity companies. And then once that creates some secondary level of comfort with some of these next level multimodal interaction models, it'll like unlock a next level hunger for home applications of this stuff. There may also be like a second splint, which is like if I don't know how HoloLens and Oculus are approaching like voice interaction, but like if either of those was to take off, that would also push this stuff to the forefront from a consumer direction. But I think it's going to be productivity that and like public space engineering, like museums, that really pushes this.
Maybe the museum comes to you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights and a preview of your book content. You've given us a lot of amazing things to think about this evening. I really appreciate your time, Cheryl, and thank you everyone for being here. Once again, the discount for all Rosenfeld Media books is in the chat. And thank you very much and have a great evening. Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye.